Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and this is the new Moondrop Cross Crinacle Dusk. Not to be confused with the old Dusk, this is the new one. And this is an IEM that has got a lot of hype on it right now, and I think with pretty good reason. If you recall, back in 2020 was when the original Dusk came out, and that IEM honestly kind of like not only set the bar for collab IEMs, but it kind of just like paved the way for collab IEMs. Like there were some others before that, but really it was the original Dusk that got people excited about collab IEMs, and specifically IEMs from Crinacle. So the new Dusk, it's been out for a couple of weeks, and you might notice that my review is a little bit later than some others, and that's because, well, that's intentional. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of hype for this IEM coming out up front, and the hype is fun. But also hype can be a little bit distorting for interpretation, opinion about an IM. And so I want to make sure that the opinion I come to you with is the take I'm going to have in a year or two. And so for the past couple of weeks, I've been living with the Dusk, listening to it, comparing it with some other IMs in its price range. And today we're going to talk about what I think about this. Now, in the meantime, there has been some interesting controversy kind of bubbling up, a growing narrative. This IM requires its DSP crutch. And if you don't know what DSP is, we'll talk about that in a little bit more. I want to say up front, I'm going to be reviewing this IM from the perspective of a 3.5 millimeter IM. You'll see I've got it on the 3.5 mil cable right now. And I'll talk about why I'm going to be reviewing it from that perspective. But I will say up front that in this configuration, I honestly think, like if you're spending around $300-400 on an IM, this is the one to get. But I'm giving you a little bit of a spoiler. So, like I mentioned, we're gonna dive through a bunch of different things. We're gonna talk about some comparisons directly with this IM versus some others. We'll talk about the DSP cable, why I'm not using it, and then I will finally give you my conclusion on the Moondrop Cross Crinacle Dusk. Checking my notes. Anything else I want to cover before we dive in? I don't think so. So let's start by talking about the build quality here in the Dusk, the physical stuff, what you get inside the box, and then we'll get into talking about the sound a little bit later. But here you go. This is the spread. This is the box itself, which has got, of course, a Crin-inspired waifu. That's nice. But otherwise, the accessories you get here are pretty similar to what you get, if not exactly the same as what you got with the Moondrop Blessing 3, because this IM, while it is not technically a Moondrop Blessing, and we'll talk a little bit more about why, it is very much inspired by the Moondrop Blessing 3, or very similar. So you do get a little carry case. I'll say probably the same thing I said about the Blessing 3 carry case, because I assume it came with this, is that it is a nice case, but a little bit on the large side for my tastes. But I guess it is nice because you do get two different cables with this, which we'll talk about in a second. Notable, I don't remember if this is true of the Blessing 3 or not, but the Dusk does come with Moondrop's spring tips. And this is notable for a couple of reasons. One, because I've actually found that the spring tips ended up being like my favorite tips on the Moondrop Blessing 2, which, if you recall, I was a big fan of. But also because it seems like Moondrop's kind of been, I don't know, they haven't included the spring tips on a number of their other recent IMs, so I kind of thought they forgot about them. But they're back here on the Dusk, which is nice to see. And then, as I mentioned, it comes with two cables. And this is going to end up being a pretty big point about the Dusk, something that you should understand, okay? Over here on the left, I've got it on a standard 3.5 millimeter cable. And like I was mentioning, this is the same exact accessory package that you're getting with the Blessing 3. So this is indeed the same cable as the Moondrop Blessing 3, which is generally a pretty nice cable. I like that it's lightweight. Behavior on it is okay. You can see it's a little bit memory prone. And because of that, I actually prefer the Moondrop Chew cable. But as far as stock cables go, this one's quite nice. It's got a nice little svelte Y-split with an integrated chin cinch that you can see actually stays in place. That's nice. Thank you, Moondrop. And then, of course, you've got your preformed ear hooks and your standard 2-pin connector. So because it's a standard 2-pin connector, you can swap this onto any cable. There is nothing particularly special about this cable. Again, this is just kind of a typical analog 3.5 mil cable. Pretty basic run of the mill. Now, what we have over here with this other cable is, okay, it looks different. It's got like a braided style. Punch in on that so you can take a look. It's got a braid. It's got this, actually kind of like the gray coloration on this. This is a DSP cable, however, so this is pretty different. It does still have your standard 2-pin connectors, up here at the top. But the big difference is that down here at the bottom, you've got a USB connector. And if you know anything about audio, you should know that you can't just have a USB connector without also having a DAC built into an audio cable like this. So this thing has a DAC built into it with digital signal processing, DSP, or as you might know it, another term is EQ, okay? So basically there is tuning of the IM that is pre-applied with the cable, which means if you are listening to this IM on a standard analog cable, like again, I said I've been listening to it on, you don't get that tuning. And what that tuning does, and is it better or not? Well, I'll spoil it right now. I do think it does sound better, but we'll talk about why I'm still not really using this cable that much. Other than that, I guess not much to talk about. I did want to briefly talk about the, well, I guess we need to talk about the earpieces, so I guess that's a good time for me to segue into talking about the internals. This is I guess I was going to say a hybrid driver configuration like the Blessing 3, but it's actually technically a tribrid because the original Blessing 3 has two dynamic drivers for the bass. They're like in this horizontally opposed sort of configuration, which is kind of unique to the Blessing 3. They're doing that same thing over here with the Dusk. But the Blessing 3 then also combines that with, I believe, 4 balanced armatures. And then here with the Dusk, instead of having 4 balanced armatures, they've still got 2 balanced armatures, but then they're mixing that now with 2 microplanar drivers, which if you look at them inside of the case, they look like balanced armatures. So these are not like the same planar driver that you would expect in something like a 7 Hertz timeless IM, but they are nonetheless a different technology. And because of that, this thing doesn't carry the Blessing name. This is not a Blessing Dusk. This is just the Crinacle Dusk. And it's interesting that they did that driver change, which we'll talk a little bit about in sound, but I'll be honest, like from the perspective of a person in my position, listening to an IM, I'm not building them, it's pretty hard for me to tell if the planar is necessarily any different than the balanced armature. Can only tell you what this thing sounds like versus the Blessing 3, which we will be talking about. So, all right, so that is it for the physical differences. Okay, I didn't mention it looks a little bit different because they've got a different faceplate on this. The original Blessing 3, which I will slide into view here in a little bit, or right now for a little bit. It's got this mirrored finish on it, which I think actually looks pretty cool, but as you can see, it does pick up fingerprints and scratches pretty heavily. So I kind of prefer the design they went with the Dusk. It does have the word Dusk stamped in there, but I think tastefully it's only on one side of it, which I appreciate. Thank you for doing that. You don't need everything to be perfectly symmetrical. When you're doing something like stamping in a brand or a logo, one side is good enough. Then when it comes to fit, this thing is going to fit exactly like a Moondrop Blessing 3. So if you haven't worn that, it probably doesn't help you that much. But if you have worn something like the Moondrop Blessing 2, this is going to be very, very familiar. The shell shape is effectively exactly the same. The only difference that they made with the original Blessing 3 about a year ago was that they made the nozzle quite a bit narrower. The rest of the IM is still a pretty bulky IM, I'll be honest. I would describe this as like a medium-large fitting IM, but as you can see in my ear, it fits quite comfortably. Frankly, when I first wore a Blessing 2, again, very similar design, I was a little intimidated by the size, I'll be honest, and I probably even overstated like potential fit risks that people have, because it was my first time, I guess, wearing an IM that large. Now, a couple of years later, having worn the Blessing 2 and now the Blessing 3 and now the Dusk, I just generally find this to be a quite comfortable and stable fitting IM. You might be able to tell, it's not really coming across on the video angle that I can see, but it does stick out slightly, although nonetheless there is a little anti-tragus catch here to catch this little part of my ear and keep it very secure fitting, which I appreciate. Comfort-wise, it's good. Again, I would say not the most comfortable because it does take up quite a bit of volume inside of the ear, but I really have no issues with the comfort on this guy. And in fact, wearing it through the night, I've worn this to bed almost every night for the past 2 weeks that I've had this IM. Yeah, that's right. We do that here. All right, yeah, anything else to talk about physical? I don't think so. So I guess briefly, I will show you the nozzle for the nozzle peepers? Nozzle peeper peoples. There you go. It's, you can see that it is actually, fairly narrow considering the bulk of the rest of the IM. And this is honestly where I'm talking about this thing being a little bit on the bulky side still inside the ear. Okay, all right, I think we're getting ready to talk about sound, folks. So strap in. I'm gonna tell you about my favorite stuff here on the Dusk. And like I mentioned up front, I'm reviewing this primarily from the perspective of a 3.5 millimeter IM, or just an analog IM. So the sound descriptions that we're about to go through, I'm gonna start with talking about how this thing sounds on the analog cable. And then I'm going to talk about what the DSP cable does to it, because again, it does make it better. It does make it better, I will be honest. But okay, let's dive in and talk about the sound. The stock tonality on this guy is pretty reminiscent, honestly, of the Moondrop Blessing 3, which if you haven't heard it, that doesn't tell you that much. But the Moondrop Blessing 3, for context, is a neutral mid-range focus. I am a little bit on the thin side, a little bit on the forward, very much a vocal focused sound, and a little bit light on bass. Okay, that's what the original Blessing 3 is. The Dusk here kind of takes that formula and modifies it, and I think it modifies it in actually pretty nice ways. I think both of the significant changes that they've made here to the default tuning are changes I appreciate. So still, I would describe the tuning on this guy a little bit on the thin side, a little bit on the clinical side, but it's very much a balanced neutral mid-range that has now a hefty sub-bass boost. The original Blessing 3 had a little bit of a sub-bass boost. Here with the Dusk, we've got a pretty significantly boosted sub-bass, and I also a little bit reduced in sort of like the presence region. So like, 3 to 6K, it's a little bit reduced here on the Dusk. And now that double whammy of changes, while I would still describe the Dusk as a somewhat thin clinical sounding IM, those two changes, I think, very tastefully balance out that thin clinicalness and give it a little bit of extra body, and just overall a higher engagement factor. Again, we'll talk about the technical performance in a little bit, but those two changes I think really do balance out the thinness to the point that I actually don't really mind the thinner sound that we get here on the Dusk. Whereas in the B3, and I still love the B3, just for context, before I got the Dusk, I spent like a week straight listening to the B3 to kind of acclimate myself. I still like the B3 quite a bit, but I would complain that it's a little bit on the thin side. Here with the Dusk, I wouldn't really have that complaint about it because again, it's balancing it out pretty well with that added extra bass boost and that reduced presence region. Now, I would say that the bass boost that is here is tasteful. It is not as aggressive as the bass boost on the original Dusk, if you're familiar with that one. Maybe we'll talk. I will talk about more this thing directly versus the original Dusk. But I will say, if you're used to the bass levels on the original Dusk, I think these are a little bit reduced, and because of that, for my taste, it's actually much better. Okay. Did I want to talk about? All right, let's talk about what the cable does. We'll talk about this now. All right, so I mentioned that this cable has a DAC built into it, and it's basically got EQ built into the DAC. And what that does is it honestly makes this thing sound almost exactly like what I want an IM to sound like in terms of tonal balance. It warms up that somewhat thin clinical mid-range and just gives it a little bit of extra body, a little bit of extra texturing in the mid-range and vocals, which is what I like. It does also have the effect of the impact of making this one sound a little bit on the bassier side. It doesn't necessarily increase a whole lot in like the sub-bass region, where again the Dusk on analog has that emphasis already, but it does meeten up that mid bass, so it gives it a little bit more punch, a little bit more body. But again, I would say it's a very tasteful balance here, even with the cable, even with that extra bit of bass. I would just say this one's a little bit less bright versus the analog version of the Dusk, because this one does come across a little bit more contrasty. This one comes across a little bit lower contrast, a little bit softer, and just again a whole lot richer, which for me is exactly what I want. And yet, nonetheless, I haven't been really using the USB cable. All right, let's just focus now talking about the technical performance here on the Dusk, and I'll keep this fairly brief, but the one thing I want to say up front is that the bass on this guy is standout. All right, it's not just like a well-tuned bass, it's not just a well-balanced bass. I think that the quality of the bass on this guy is above a lot of bass qualities, and to be honest, that was also true, if you recall what I said, of the Blessing 3. I think the Blessing 3 bass, despite being pretty, you could call it anemic on the bass, It's a really nice quality. And fortunately, that quality carries through here with the Dusk, even though we've got the elevated bass amount. So basically what I'm just saying is that it's like super tight. It hits really hard and impactful despite not being overwhelming tonally, which is exactly what I want out of a bass response, right? I want to hear the mid-range. I want to hear the treble and the details and the texturing and all that good stuff. But I do want the impact and the feeling, the sensation of bass. I just don't want it to crowd out the rest of it. And I think with the Dusk, you just get a really excellent balance of a nice sense, nice bass levels, but also just a really good sense of that physicality and snap in the bass response that sometimes, you know, other IMs get it just by giving you too much bass, frankly. So really quite outstanding there. I would say that the imaging separation and stuff like that on the Dusk is very, very good, above average for sure. About on par with the Blessing 3. I wouldn't say it's necessarily any better, any worse. Yeah, I think that if, again, coming from the Blessing 2, one of my complaints about the Blessing 2 is that the treble performance on it was a little bit lackluster in terms of its extension, as well as a little bit of a sharp character to it. And I think that like the Blessing 3, the non-Blessing Dusk, it keeps those improvements, right? The extension on this guy is great. If you're listening to things, high frequency percussion, hi-hats, drum brushes, and stuff like that, they've all got a nice natural metallic timbre, which is what you want to hear from metal things. They do it really well versus the sort of plasticky Blessing 2. You just get a really good sense of micro contrast. I think the vocal, the word I wrote down here, I'm a little hesitant to say it, but delicateness. Like when I'm talking about the micro contrast in vocals, like just try to thinking of like a nice soft vocal that's not super in your face or anything like that, but you're able to appreciate all of the finer nuance and texture in that vocal reproduction. That's what I like to hear out of an IM, and the Dusk does it really quite well. When you do use the DSP cable, I've noted this down, because it is warming it up a little bit, and this is just kind of a natural thing with tonal balance changes like this, I do think that this loses a little bit of the separation that you get here from the analog version of the Dusk. You do gain that body and that richness as sort of the trade-off again, sort of the tonal balance changes, but I do think that in terms of the technical performance, that the analog version actually sounds a little bit more technical, a little bit more clinical, I suppose. But again, that's a not unique trade-off here in the Dusk. And just generally, I would say that the technical performance on this guy, even though this IM is priced at $360, which is not cheap, but I think versus other $360, $400 IMs, I think this guy competes with stuff that's even significantly more expensive. So those are really my thoughts here on the sound on this guy. Again, we are going to get into some comparisons, but I did want to briefly touch on why I'm not using the DSP cable. All right. And it's a couple of things. One of them is actually a physical thing. I'm not, this is a very subtle thing, but I'm not a big fan of having an inline microphone in there. You might notice that I like to rotary wrap my stuff, and having an inline microphone gets in the way of that. Is that the real reason I'm not listening to this cable? No, but it's one of the things that kind of bugs me about it. The real reasons are, I would say threefold, okay? Reason number one, is that this thing just doesn't play well with my digital audio players. I use Hibby audio players, and if I'm honest, I think the fault is on Hibby because they don't really play well with other USB DACs, but nonetheless, that's where my music is on. I have my music on my audio players. I plug this thing into those. It doesn't really work well with them. And by it doesn't work well, on one of them, I don't get the DSP for whatever reason. On the other, I only get 100% volume, which I'm not a masochist, so I don't listen at that loud of a level. Okay, so the other reasons is that even when this thing is working at its best, when I connect it to my MacBook as an example, or to an Android phone, which it works well with, I hear weird audio artifacts on it. And that's true of this cable and other permutations, because Moondrop has been selling this cable for about 6 months, maybe even a little bit longer. And they even include it with some other IMs like the Moondrop May. Same cable, this thing has kind of the same problems where there's just like these weird audio artifacts that you can especially hear at like the silent beginnings of songs, but even like in the middle of songs, again, during quieter parts, you can hear it there. And it's just, it's pretty annoying, pretty distracting. It's not what I want to hear in my hi-fi, I suppose. I guess I'll also complain that the app that Moondrop has built for these is not great. If you're fine with the stock tuning, and again, the stock tuning is basically my ideal, so maybe I shouldn't even be voicing this complaint. But if you want to play around with the app that Moondrop has, one, it's only available on Android. Two, it is kind of clunky, to be honest. And it has a bunch of weird limitations, like you can't EQ above 10,000 hertz or below 60 hertz. And I think there's also limitations in terms of like how much of an adjustment, a gain or a anti-gain that you can apply. Anyway, these are just reasons that I'm not a big fan, frankly, of this cable. And then the last thing that I wanted to say is that if I'm going to be listening to an IM with DSP, right? If I'm going to be either just accepting this cable, listening not on my audio players because they're not compatible, for whatever reason, if I prefer DSP, there's kind of the question of, do I even need the Dusk? Could I just use any IM and EQ it to the same frequency response as the Dusk and get the same sound? And honestly, that was like a legit question I had going into this. And so I kind of did some experimentation with that. So let me pull in for our comparisons, the first round of comparisons, which is the round of comparisons that at least one of these comparisons no one was asking for, but I thought it was nonetheless notable, okay? So what I did was I have this cable, right? The DSP cable that came with the Dusk. Here I have the Moondrop May, which has its own DSP cable as well. I've got it sitting over here. I've got a third free DSP cable, Moondrop DSP cable, that I used on the Blessing 3. And what I did was I set the Dusk on its default EQ, which again sounds phenomenal, and I created my own custom EQ profiles to make the Blessing 3 match that frequency response and to make the May match that frequency response. Now what's notable is that the Blessing 3 price range is pretty similar to the Dusk. It's a little bit cheaper, I think 320 bucks, but if you were to buy it with this cable, about the same price. The May is significantly cheaper. I think this thing's like 65 bucks, and it comes with a DSP cable. So here's what I found, okay? Listening to the Blessing 3 on DSP cable versus the Dusk on its stock default DSP, very, very close in terms of the differences between them. To be honest, if you didn't tell me which one was in my ear, I am pretty sure I would not be able to tell you, right? They sound very, very similar. There's not like any obvious technical differences between them. Maybe the Blessing 3 is a little bit smoother up top. And part of that is because, again, like the DSP cable doesn't let you adjust anything above 10,000 hertz. So whatever the stock tuning is of the IM is kind of what you're going to be getting with that. And I found that the Blessing 3 is maybe a little bit smoother up top. But honestly, again, if you didn't tell me which one was in my ear, I'm pretty sure I would not be able to tell you which is which. Now, the more interesting, and that's not too surprising, I'll be honest, okay? Because again, they have a lot in common with the internals. Similar price range, they fit exactly the same in my ear. But here with the May, this is where it was actually a little bit more surprising in that they're closer than you might think, okay? 65 bucks versus 360 bucks. If I'm using a DSP cable on both, I don't want to say this thing sounds as good as the Dusk, but it was maybe a little bit harder for me to find the differences than I would guess. I would say that, again, the treble in this guy, because you can't adjust it past 10K, it's definitely like a little chittier. It's a technical term. It's a little bit more annoying, I suppose, in that sense, or maybe you could even describe it as sounding a little bit more technical depending on how you interpret those sorts of things. But I found the treble in this guy a little bit more annoying. The bass impact is not as tight. And I would say that the separation between sounds, the stereo separation, is not quite as good because, again, it's really good here in the Dusk. But if you apply that same EQ to the May, you get pretty close. Honestly, it's not that far off. But again, I don't really want to use the DSP cable. And so that's why primarily I listen to this thing on a 3.5 mil. And I also wanted to compare it to some other IMs that I listen to on a 3.5 mil. So let's pull those guys in, all right? And we'll do these comparisons. And I'll try to get through this quickly because I know this review is going on a little bit long, but like I kind of promised in the thumbnail, this has got to be the definitive review. I'm trying to answer all the questions I had going into this review, so hopefully all of your questions are answered. All right, let's, we've got the original, no. There we go. We've got the original Moondrop Blessing 2 Dusk. This is the one that came out back in 2020 that kickstarted everything. Here we've got the Blessing 3, which I'll do some comparisons on analog. And here we've got, well, technically this is the Thea Audio Hype 2. I think the Hype 4 is the better comparison. I have my Hype 4 on loan. So for today, let's pretend this is the Hype 4. And all the comparisons I'm going to describe are assuming we're talking about the Hype 4. All right, but let's focus in and zero in real quickly here on the Blessing 2 Dusk and how these things are different. Because if you've already got this one, you might be wondering, is it even worth getting the Dusk if all you're going to do is listen on 3.5? I'll just say up front, the Blessing 2 Dusk still holds up surprisingly well. I would say that the bass on this guy is more aggressive. It's more blammy, more in your face. And to be honest, I find that a little bit distracting. But if that's what you're after in your sound, you might actually still prefer the Blessing 2 Dusk because, again, it holds up well and it does have that more aggressive bass sound. I would say that the Dusk, or the original Dusk, is a little bit more contrasty, maybe a little bit more V-shaped in its tonality, and slightly thinner in the mid-range. Again, this one I think warms up the mid-range a little bit versus the Blessing 3, whereas this one I think is even a little bit thinner than the Blessing 3. I would say overall, yeah, the Dusk is a little bit more mid-range balanced. And the big difference, apart from the bass quality, I didn't even mention this in my notes, but yeah, the bass quality on the Dusk is just, it's better, okay? This one's blammier, there's more bass, it's a little bit more impactful, aggressive, and fun, I suppose. But for my preferences, I definitely prefer the bass, not just the levels here, but the quality of the tactility on it, just really, again, next level, outstanding bass quality. The other thing that's really pretty standout and different on the new Dusk is the treble performance. The high frequency percussion just sounds much more realistic, metallic, better timbre, whereas here on the Blessing 2 and the Dusk version as well, you do get kind of a little bit of a plasticiness with things like hi-hats. So that's that comparison out of the way. Let me pull in now the Blessing 3. And I know I already just kind of described them a little bit, but I was talking about them on DSP cables. Now I'm talking about them on analog cables, all right? The Blessing 3, honestly, I think this guy's a little bit underappreciated, even by myself. I did my earphone of the Ear Awards a few months ago, and I kind of omitted this one intentionally from those awards because as much as I respect this IM, I was a little bit let down in terms of the tonal direction that they went with it because it's the opposite of what I want. I like the Blessing 2's tonal balance, and this guy went a little bit too thin. Thankfully for me, the Dusk brings it back a little bit. Now it doesn't go all the way to the Blessing 2's tonality. It's still a little bit on the thin clinical sound, assuming the analog cable. But again, that double whammy of pulling down the upper mids and adding a little bit more bass body really does warm it up a significant amount that I much prefer the tonality on this guy. Whereas with the Dusk, the original Dusk versus the Blessing 2, I preferred the Blessing 2. Here with the Blessing 3 versus the new Dusk, I prefer the new Dusk. They both have that really outstanding bass quality. I think treble performance on them is very similar. Maybe a little bit smoother up top here. And this is where I'm getting into like probably over-interpreting this difference of the planar, the microplanars doing the treble versus balanced armatures. I feel like I do prefer the treble a little bit on this guy, but it just comes across maybe a little bit extra digital here on the Dusk. But otherwise, this one's just a little bit brighter, a little bit thinner, less bassy. This guy's a little bit bassier, smidge warmer, and just frankly, a lot more engaging overall. You get a better sense of depth, maybe a little bit extra sense of width over here, but at that point, you're honestly splitting hairs. I think the depth difference is going to be something that stands out to people a lot more, and that is where the Dusk has the advantage. And now finally, again, pretend this is a Thea Audio Hype 4. Let's make this comparison. The Hype 4 is a significantly bassier set, all right? They both have like this sort of neutral balanced tonality up top with a very fun party in the back bass boost, but the bass boost on the Hype 4, and true of the Hype 2 as well, is significantly more than the Dusk. So if you're looking for that business in the front, party in the back sound, you might actually prefer the Hype 4. I think that, honestly though, the bass quality, again, even with the Hype 4, I think the bass quality on the Dusk is better. It's got more of that snap, and it's got that better attack, that sharper leading edge attack on the bass transients that I find really satisfying. And I also find that personally for my tastes, the tonal balance levels of this are better for me than this, whereas the bass levels that you get on the Hype can start to mask a little bit of the lower mid-range and make this one sound just less mid-range focus versus the Dusk, which despite having that bass boost, still sounds very much like a vocal focused, mid-range focused tonality. So for my preferences, it's all about the Dusk, I'll be honest. In terms of other technical aspects, in terms of like stereo width, I think that the Hype does have an advantage here. And that's the thing that's just kind of stand out on both the Hype 2 and the Hype 4 is their stereo width and like how well they separate sounds. It's kind of fun, honestly. It sounds a little bit like listening to something out of like a Dolby Atmos mix. All right. Maybe a little bit artificial, you could say, but it's definitely a lot of fun. The Dusk is no slouch in terms of its stereo imaging. Again, I think it is above average for the price point and even competes with stuff that's more expensive, but it's not going to have that same wow factor as something like the Hype 4. But overall, if I'm honest, I much prefer the Dusk. This is just it's my preferred tonal balance. And then the stereo width imaging, while it's fun on the Hype, it's not as continually gratifying, I suppose, as the bass advantage that you get here on the Dusk, at least in my opinion. So I think that is going to do it for my review here on the Moondrop Dusk. And again, I am reviewing this primarily from the perspective of an analog IM because that is how I want to use a product like this. And let's forget the DSP caveats, right? As a regular $360 analog IM, I think this is the best out there. All right. Depending on what your favorite, you could even argue that this is like the best IM under probably like the Moondrop S8 is still probably a little bit better, if I'm honest. But under that, and they don't even make that anymore, but that's $700, all right? Under that, I can't think of another IM that I like as much as the new Moondrop Crinacle Dusk. Could it be better? Well, yeah, DSP kind of proves that it can get better than this. But is it enough for me to want to use the DSP cable? No, because this thing sounds fantastic as is. And as you probably are not going to be surprised, I give this guy 5 stars out of 5. And if you want to check out the Dusk, of course, I got it linked in the description down below. Shout out to Shenzhen Audio, by the way, for sending this guy in for review. I should have called them out earlier. But anyway, yeah, while you're down there looking for the link, if you haven't already, please do hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, and I'll catch you on the next super review, unless you're here live, in which case, hang around, pass this message, and we will stick around for a chat. Cheers.